It begins in a quiet pharmacy on an ordinary night. An industrious black woman arrives exhausted from a long shift to pick up her prescription, but a slight mistake leads to suspicion. Things take a terrible turn when dishonest cops arrive to humiliate and degrade her without considering what they don't know. She's not alone, and her storm will destroy everything they thought they controlled. Stick with us because the twists are larger than anyone could imagine. Tell us where you're listening. We'd love to hear your story. It was supposed to be just another average night. 58-year-old nurse Sarah Johnson, who had spent the past 30 years fixing shattered bodies and comforting souls, ended a hard double shift. Her feet hurt, and her back was weary after hours of rounds. Yet as the Georgia heat persisted, all she could think about was refilling her prescription before going home. The air was dense and sticky, even though the sun had set hours earlier. The kind of night where even the breeze felt exhausted. The local drugstore sat on the corner of a sleepy suburban strip mall, mostly dark. Sarah parked her aging vehicle under a flickering streetlight, grabbed her purse, and went inside. A nurse's fatigued elegance seemed natural and calm, though her body cried for rest. Inside, the pharmacy was virtually empty. A teenage clerk yawned behind the counter, tapping aimlessly. Sarah smiled, handing him her ID, insurance card, and the little paper slip the doctor wrote for her usual blood pressure medication. She had picked up prescriptions here for years. The boy appeared bored, scanning the documents, ignoring her, and typing on the register. Minutes passed more slowly than expected. He shifted from foot to foot, grimacing at the computer screen, then murmured to a white woman in her 40s, with a pinched face, the store manager. She looked at Sarah like she'd smelled something bad, clenched her lips, and tapped the computer screen. Sarah couldn't hear their whispers, but the air shifted. She immediately felt an enormous, invisible weight crushing down on her shoulders. The suspicion every black person recognizes when it slithers in. Finally, the manager approached, her brittle grin and sugary voice offset by twitchy hands. "Sorry, ma'am, there's a problem with your prescription." Sarah frowned, perplexed but calm. "I've bought this medication here for years." The manager's hands twitched. "The account details don't match. We can't handle this tonight." Sarah leaned in slightly. "Not possible. My ID and insurance card match. Check again." The manager's chin lifted. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait here, ma'am. We've contacted the authorities to investigate." Sarah assumed she misheard. "Authorities!" she repeated, her voice dangerously level. The counter boy looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, avoiding her gaze. Sarah breathed slowly, knowing she'd been convicted. Years in emergency rooms had taught her how to stay calm as the walls closed in, but this was colder, something older than lousy customer service, the nasty, familiar stink of being deemed guilty by skin tone before speaking. Beyond the faint wail of sirens, Sarah stood her ground in the warm night air. She could have demanded her paperwork back and left, but that would have looked guilty, and she had done nothing wrong. This time, she would wait. Minutes later, 2 police officers entered, the door chiming violently. White, casually authoritative, they expected the world to stop when they walked in. The first officer was towering, broad-chested. The second, younger and thinner, with a buzz cut and faint scowl, looked unsure if he should enjoy this. Sarah noticed their short, sleepy glance. Assumption, not curiosity. The manager rushed forward, her voice falling urgently. "That's her," she muttered, "trying to pick up medication fraudulently. The accounts don't match. She may be using someone else's insurance." The first officer didn't look at the computer or request documents. He straightened his shoulders and approached Sarah like a predator surrounding injured prey. "Ma'am," he said condescendingly, "I need you to step outside." Sarah stood tall. "I haven't done anything wrong." The younger officer shifted uneasily, but said nothing. The manager folded her arms, watching with a bit of pleasure. The first officer put his hand on his belt. "We can do this easy or hard," he said, the menace barely disguised. Other customers stared. A woman took her child's hand and ran. A man near the cold medicine aisle started recording with his phone. Sarah spotted the tiny movement out of the corner of her eye. Good, let them record. Motionless, she felt the familiar fire in her chest, the tight knot of wrath and humiliation, tangled after a lifetime of saving lives. She was punished like a criminal for comforting the dying and pulling double shifts during pandemics, all because of her skin color. Sarah forced herself to breathe deeply, keeping a calm look as her heart raced. I have my ID, insurance, and prescription proof, she said. The officer scarcely glanced at the documents. Step outside. When she didn't move, he grabbed her wrist violently, eliciting gasps in the pharmacy. Sarah didn't fight. Fighting would excuse what they wished. She let herself be dragged out, head held high, as the metal of the handcuffs cut against her skin. She heard muttering and felt scores of eyes on her through the mounting emotion. The manager smiled triumphantly, but Sarah didn't look away. As they pushed her into the police car, she looked at the officer with steely resolve. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. The door slammed, trapping her inside. Deep in her chest, past the pain and shame, a small chilly flame began to burn. They didn't know who they were messing with, but they would. The judgment would be rapid, violent, and leave a mark they'd never forget. The journey to the station was quiet but not peaceful. Sarah sat stiffly in the back seat, handcuffs cutting into her wrists, the chilly metal pressing into bone. She didn't speak or move, knowing they could twist quiet into guilt. But no explanation would change what the officers in front had decided about her. Officer Rick Coleman, driving, and Officer David Miller, sitting shotgun, spoke in low, casual voices like she wasn't there. Like a box they'd picked up to be filed before getting late-night coffee. Coleman laughed at Miller's comment, shaking his head. Another fraud case. Why do these people think they can stroll in? Sarah heard every word despite his low voice. Miller mumbled something vague but didn't disagree. Sarah watched Savannah's lights blur through the glass, her jaw tightening. Every muscle wanted to scream, to demand they see her, but she knew better. She'd seen too many who didn't leave the back seat as they entered. At the rundown precinct, Coleman yanked the door open, waving her out impatiently. Let's go. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She cautiously exited, feeling every eye on her while other cops sipped coffee, chatting, pretending not to see. Sarah felt their curiosity like a weight on her back. Inside, the station was no better. Scuffed floors, sickly off-white walls, fluorescent lights, and the smell of cheap disinfectant and stale coffee. They took her to the booking desk, where Miller fiddled with the cuffs and Coleman scribbled a form. Name, Sarah Johnson, 58, black. Sarah assumed they only cared about that last box. Coleman smirked as he slid the document to the desk sergeant. Suspected prescription fraud, he shouted to everyone within 20 feet, caught red-handed at the pharmacy. The balding sergeant with heavy jowls glanced at Sarah and shrugged. Another black woman, another statistic, another mugshot. The camera flashed, blinding, clicking like a door closing. They fingerprinted her, pushing her wrists into the ink pad, rolling each finger mechanically, like she was guilty, like there was no purpose in pretending otherwise. They led her to the holding cells, Sarah's slow, methodical steps squeaking against the linoleum. She overheard conversation as they passed. She's a fraudster. Every statement hurt, not because she believed them, but because lies could take root and become truths for those who didn't want to know better. They pushed her into a cell with a chilly metal bench bolted to the wall. The door clanged shut. Coleman leaned against the bars mockingly. You want to tell us the real story now? Might go easier if you come clean. Sarah ignored him. The real story is you're going to regret tonight. Miller, leaning against the wall, scoffed. Yeah, sure. You got a magic lawyer hiding in your purse or something? She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Coleman shrugged. Suit yourself. Sit down and think about it. They left, their heavy boots thudding on the floor. Under the buzzing fluorescent lights and bleach smell, Sarah sat, hands in her lap, breathing slow. She twisted her wrists, scrutinizing the scarlet welts from the cuffs, a reminder not just of tonight, but of what they were always eager to do if no one called them out. She shifted, feeling the cold metal seat. Despite the concrete walls and exhaustion, underneath the wounds and shame, that small flame blazed fiercely. All the unfairness might have broken someone else, but Sarah Johnson had suffered worse and wasn't alone. The clock above the booking desk ticked loudly, 9:42 p.m. She knew Robert would be coming soon. Her father, who didn't waste time with injustice, tonight would only make him move quicker, more dangerously. In the corridor, noises rose, first low, then louder. Coleman slapped the desk. "You mean someone's calling from D.C. at this hour?" A pause, then, "Tell them." Sarah smiled to herself, recognizing the tone. The confidence of a man who thought he could walk out of quicksand but was already sinking. The phone rang again, louder, longer. Another cop grabbed it, his voice tightening instantly. "Yes, sir." Sarah reclined on the chilly concrete, closing her eyes briefly. They thought they were dealing with another exhausted black woman, too weak to fight back. But they'd lit a match over a gasoline pool, and the fire was coming. Not in days, not in weeks, but tonight. She opened her eyes and waited, because justice wasn't just a dream for Sarah Johnson. The storm was coming. Sarah sat erect in the holding cell as minutes passed like hours, hands safe in her lap, refusing to slouch or show defeat. If they wanted to humiliate her, they'd have to work harder. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, sometimes heavy boots stomping purposefully, sometimes lazy shuffling of someone killing time. None stopped at her door or glanced her way. They didn't need to. She was already categorized and forgotten. Another case number, another woman they didn't care about. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered, casting jerky shadows. A crisp, frantic phone call down the hall was promptly answered and cut off. Sarah could feel the building's tension shift, like air pressure before a storm. Officer Coleman swaggered down the hallway, pretending not to be spooked, but his smirk was thinner now, a cracked mask barely holding together. He halted outside her cell, touching the bars. "How you holding up in there, Grandma?" he drawled. Sarah cocked her head, examining him. He needed a response, but she remained silent. Coleman shrugged like it didn't concern him. "We could have let you off with a warning, but now you're facing real charges. Attempted fraud, maybe evading arrest if we want to be creative." He smiled broader, but his eyes darted toward the front desk, where officers whispered more aggressively. Sarah smiled slowly. "Are you unaware?" she said quietly. Coleman's smile sagged. "Realize what?" She leaned forward, voice quiet and steady. "That the walls are closing in." Before he could answer, the front door banged open hard, a distinct silence sweeping across the building. Sarah stayed perfectly still, holding her breath. She didn't need to see him to know who had entered. Robert Johnson, her father, a former FBI legend whose reputation still made law enforcement sit straighter and talk more carefully. The man who spent decades pulling dishonest cops from their hiding places and casting a blazing light into their darkness was here for her. Hushed voices at the front desk, not angry, but calmly controlled. A few, "Yes, sir," murmurs scattered quickly. Officers move like roaches when the light flicks on. Miller appeared, walking slowly toward the back, pallid and nervous, glancing at the holding cells. Coleman snapped at him under his breath, but Sarah saw the arrogance cracking, the reality dawning. He knew something was wrong, but didn't know how bad it would get. Two men in dark suits and earpieces followed, federal agents, not local. Sarah recognized them immediately. Robert Johnson walked behind them. He hadn't changed much since retiring, maybe more lines on his face, silver in his closely trimmed hair, but his clear eyes, straight back, and presence flooded a place like a storm, slow and unavoidable. Ignoring the cops, he gazed at Sarah. When their eyes met, 1,000 unspoken words passed. "I'm here. You're not alone." Robert turned to Coleman, and the effect was immediate. Coleman straightened like he was in boot camp, his face blazing a furious, defensive crimson. "Who's in charge here?" Robert's voice was deadly calm. The desk sergeant fumbled forward. "That's me, sir." Robert didn't blink. "Good. Then explain why a registered nurse with proper ID and no criminal background is in a detention cell tonight." The sergeant opened and closed his mouth, sweating at his temples. Robert continued evenly and mercilessly. "Explain why your officers detained her without checking for error, why they ignored her identity proof, why they physically restrained her in public without probable cause. And you'll want to explain cautiously, because 10 minutes ago, you started dealing with more than local consequences. The Department of Justice is investigating a federal civil rights violation." Sarah watched Coleman's face shift from crimson to gray, his jaw gripped so tightly it must have hurt. Robert nodded to the two agents beside him. "Unlock the cell," he ordered. An agent produced keys and moved. Coleman finally spoke, voice tight. "You can't just walk in here." Robert glanced at him, gaze frozen. "I already have." The cell door opened with a gentle metallic creak. Robert offered his hand to Sarah. She rose slowly, every muscle shouting, but stood on her own for dignity, shoulders aligned. She nodded when Robert smiled faintly and stepped aside for her to exit first. As she passed Coleman, she didn't look at him, but noticed his fisted hands and the bob of his throat as he gulped hard. He knew this wasn't finished. It was just beginning. Sarah breathed slowly and steadily for the first time that night, the air tasting like victory starting to bloom. When Sarah left the cell, the station changed. Officers who stood comfortably moments earlier found reasons to look elsewhere. The ones who laughed, who whispered, tensed, their postures blank. Robert walked behind her, a silent authority wall at her back. Two federal agents flanked them, making it clear this was no courtesy call, but a reckoning. Sarah counted each step across their halls, her wrists throbbing from the cuff's tightness. She ignored it, watching half-sentences die on people's lips as she passed. She held herself like she had every right to be there, because she did. At the front desk, the sergeant hurriedly wiped sweat off his forehead. Officer Miller lingered, back against the wall, looking like a man awaiting a verdict he already knew. Robert didn't glance at them, his attention on the desk phone, which rang again, sharp and demanding. The sergeant hesitated, lingering over the receiver like it might bite. "Answer it," Robert said quietly. The sergeant grabbed it with shaky hands. "Savannah PD," he croaked. He listened for 2 seconds before his face turned sickly gray, nodding frantically. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He held the phone, hands shaking. "It's for you." Robert took the receiver, his calm unfakeable. He didn't bark into the phone. He didn't need to. "This is Johnson," he said. A quiet pause, then a faint, frigid smile. "Good, proceed." He hung up and returned the phone to the stunned sergeant, like a prop in a play. Sarah raised an eyebrow, keeping her voice low enough for Robert to hear. "What did you just set in motion?" Robert didn't turn, staring blankly for a moment, then leaned in so no one else could hear. "You recall D.C.? They've been looking for a case. Looks like they just found it." Before Sarah could react, the station door burst open again, this time with force. More federal agents, at least 6, moved purposefully, splitting through the station, some to offices, others to files and computer terminals. An agent handed the desk sergeant a hefty folder. He grasped it like it could explode. "This station," the agent shouted, "is under immediate federal audit pending civil rights violations." A gasp rippled through the cops. Coleman stepped forward half-heartedly, face darkening. "You can't do that. This is a local matter." Robert faced him, voice calm and amused. "Read the fine print on your badge. Local authority doesn't override federal law." Coleman was about to argue when an agent stopped him with a stare that said nothing. Sarah felt the room's weight shift again, not heavy and sad, but electrified with realization. Everyone present understood the system they assumed would always protect them had turned on its head. Robert signaled for Sarah to follow him out. They didn't rush, each step a declaration. We are not powerless or invisible. Before entering the humid Georgia night, Sarah paused, glancing back. Not to gloat, but to skim the faces staring at her. Some guilty, some afraid, some astonished this night hadn't gone as usual. She held their gaze, then turned and stepped outside, unfettered. The air felt cleaner, sharper. Robert fell into stride beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Nothing needed saying. Sarah let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Robert glanced at her, smiling. "You don't ever have to thank me for protecting you. That's my job." They walked silently to the car, but before reaching it, Robert's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, grunting with satisfaction. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Robert's eyes flashed under the streetlights. Coleman and Miller's background checks? Several skeletons, excessive force complaints, racist profiling charges the department hid. Sarah shook her head, a sour smile tugging at her lips. "They thought they could make me disappear." Robert's face hardened. "They thought you were alone." He opened the car door for her. Sarah slid into the passenger seat, noticing how strange it felt to sit without cuffs biting her wrists, without structural walls. She was free, but the true struggle was beginning. They thought she was alone, and now they learned how wrong they were. Robert started the engine, and they pulled away from the curb. Sarah cast a final glance at the station, its lights still burning. The old rules that said people like her had to accept whatever was done to them were flickering. For the first time in a while, something better was emerging from the ashes, though she didn't yet know what. She was ready. Inside the station, the air grew heavier, almost tangible, wrapping around the cops like a thick, stifling fog they couldn't shake. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone felt the dreadful realization that tonight had ruined them, and there was no way out. The sergeant behind the desk kept glancing at the door, expecting someone to storm through. Younger officers who'd watched Sarah's arrest like entertainment stiffened against the walls, their laughter dying in their throats. Coleman paced like a caged animal, his boots striking the scuffed floor, glancing at the exit and back to the internal phones that hadn't stopped ringing since Robert Johnson left with Sarah. His face twisted between wrath and fear, unable to settle on either. Miller leaned against the far wall, biting his thumbnail until it bled, staring at the floor as if he could fall through it. The wall clock ticked louder than conceivable, every second dragging, every minute stretching so thin the room felt like it could collapse under the weight. Another call came. The sergeant grabbed it, yelled a few things, and slammed it down. He didn't look at anyone. No one asked what was said. They knew it was bad. A small group gathered in the lobby, citizens, bystanders who'd witnessed the pharmacy scene, their faces in online videos now viral. They pressed against the glass doors, eyes bulging, tongues moving. Though they didn't have signs yet, they whispered urgently. The storm was coming. Coleman stopped pacing, his jaw working frantically. "She resisted, made it complicated," he snapped to no one in particular. No one answered. Even Miller didn't back him up. Deep down, they knew Sarah hadn't resisted, shouted, or fought. She'd stood exhausted and dignified as they pushed her into cuffs and paraded her like a criminal. Every second that passed, the injustice was shown in shared videos, spreading virally, eyewitness accounts. The story no longer confined to Savannah, but racing across the state and country. Another federal agent entered, a woman with keen eyes and a tightened jaw, clutching a black tablet. She didn't wait to be welcomed, crossing the floor quickly. "We need full-body cam footage from tonight," she said to the desk sergeant, voice quiet but undeniable. "No edits, no gaps." The sergeant paused too long, her eyes narrowed. He fumbled for login credentials, typing quickly, hitting 2 wrong keys. Coleman watched, fists clenching. "You can't just seize our footage without a warrant," he shouted. The agent ignored him. "You waived that when you were arrested without probable cause. Congratulations." Another agent plugged a small device into the station's main server, sucking up files faster than anyone could stop. Miller made a tiny choking noise but stayed pinned by the weight of his cowardice. Coleman stepped forward, voice rising. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The female agent turned, meeting his gaze. "We know exactly what we're dealing with," she said softly, her words cold and piercing. Some cops' grumbling grew louder, more frantic, texting for updates. The captains who usually defended them weren't arriving. Unions and old boy networks were silent. They could sense it. The system wasn't circling the wagons this time. It let them hang. The internal phone rang again, urgently. No one rushed to answer. A squad room curse broke the silence as an officer dropped his coffee cup, the smash echoing like a gunshot. Nobody picked it up. The female agent opened her tablet, scrolling through body cam footage of Sarah at the pharmacy in mute condemnation. Clear as day, Sarah handing over her ID, gently explaining herself, not resisting, fighting, or doing anything to merit handcuffs. Coleman scowled as it unfolded, frame after frame. The truth needed no interpretation. No creative reporting could fix this. Coleman saw it too, his chest heaving, hands twitching like he didn't know whether to punch or run. Miller sat heavily in the nearest chair. The agent paused the video, touching the screen. "This is what happens when you think no one's looking," she murmured, rotating the tablet to face the room. No one spoke, no one moved. The body cam microphone captured Sarah's voice, quiet and steady. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." She'd said it with a thin smile. In the lobby, the crowd swelled, hints of the press arriving, cameras sparkling against the glass, microphones pressed to the door. The outside world knocked, and for the first time in a long time, the station realized they couldn't hold it back. The sergeant sagged behind the desk, his fight fading like air from a punctured tire. Savannah PD officers realized they weren't just having a bad night. They faced real judgment, and it was only beginning. The door opened again, and the atmosphere snapped so hard you could almost hear it fracture. Robert Johnson entered like he owned the building, and tonight he did. Flanked by two high-ranking Department of Justice officials with stone faces and fluorescent badges, another pair of federal officials carried large black cases that promised nothing good for anyone they were visiting. Every cop froze. Some stood instinctively, old habits kicking in like soldiers at attention. Others stared, wide-eyed, like they were seeing something they couldn't process. Robert didn't speak at first, letting the moment linger, letting them feel the power shift. The desk sergeant stammered a half-protest, but Robert silenced him with a stare that could kill. "You had your chance," he said, voice calm but deadly. "Now it's my turn." Officer Coleman stood near the back, arms crossed, chin out with defiance. But even he couldn't hide his eyes darting to the federal badges. Robert finally spoke, his voice gliding through the silence. "Robert Johnson, veteran FBI, special agent in charge, current consultant for the DOJ Civil Rights Division." He let that sink in. "As of 30 minutes ago, this police station is under federal scrutiny for multiple violations of constitutional and civil rights." A slight choke sound, a whimper or gasp, escaped someone. Coleman tried to look nonchalant but failed. Robert turned slowly, making eye contact with every officer. No wrath, no shouting, just assurance, which was worse. "We ensure justice isn't just a slogan on the wall." A DOJ official stepped forward, pulling documents from a briefcase. "Officers Rick Coleman and David Miller are suspended pending investigations into civil rights abuses, unlawful arrest, and misconduct." Coleman protested, but Robert cut him off with a single raised hand. "Save it. You'll speak under oath." The agent handed the desk sergeant two sealed envelopes. suspension notices. The sergeant took them with shaky hands. Another agent approached Coleman and Miller, arms outstretched, badges and guns. Coleman looked like he might refuse, his chest heaving, fists clenched, eyes burning with rage. But with nowhere to run, he reached up, unpinned his badge, and slapped it on the desk so hard it rattled. He removed his revolver and placed it beside it with a sharp metallic clatter. Miller followed like a man to his execution, removing his badge with shaky fingers, placing his gun softly, as if gentleness could help. Robert watched with the calm of a man who'd seen this before. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There will be grand jury hearings, depositions. If the evidence supports it, and it will, federal charges." A curse from the back of the station. Someone shushed it. Outside, the crowd grew louder, doubled, tripled. Reporters jostled, camera flashes strobing, protest signs floating in a sea of rage and hope, demanding justice. Robert nodded toward the door. "This won't go away in a week," he said quietly but deadly. He glanced at Coleman, stripping him bare with his gaze. "You thought you could shame my daughter, silence her, force her into a system that chews her up and spits her out." Robert stepped closer, voice lower, more dangerous. "You attack my family and every person who's been told they don't belong, treated like a criminal for existing." Coleman swallowed hard, his swagger peeling off like a cheap coat in a storm. "When I'm done," Robert finished, "you'll know what answering for it feels like." DOJ officials escorted Coleman and Miller out, not in cuffs, but the promise of them hung close. Robert watched them go, not with satisfaction or vengeance, but accountability. The remaining officers stood stiff, afraid to breathe loudly. Robert turned to the desk sergeant. "You'll cooperate fully with this investigation. All footage, incident reports, disciplinary files. No redactions, no missing paperwork." The sergeant nodded silently. Robert looked at him, almost pityingly. "You'll need a lawyer," he said, and walked out. Sarah emerged with him, federal agents falling behind. Outside, the crowd cheered, but Robert didn't raise a hand in the flashing lights or shouts of vindication. He stood straight, not smiling for the cameras, unmoved as justice swept through. Tonight was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, it was real, and nothing could stop it. The next morning, the sun barely rose when the first headline hit. Local police station under federal inquiry for civil rights abuse. By noon, it wasn't local. CNN and MSNBC, Fox News aired Sarah's arrest video, her face mid-frame, tired but dignified and defiant. Her name in every news chyron, Sarah Johnson, former FBI agent's daughter. The story took off because it wasn't about one woman anymore, but a rotten system exposed at last. The DOJ set up a temporary headquarters in a commandeered conference room, blocks from Savannah PD, reviewing documents, body cam footage, and subpoenaed internal correspondence 24/7. Sarah sat quietly in a corner, watching it unfold. Robert conferred with lead investigators, occasionally glancing at Sarah to ask, "You holding up?" She nodded, exhausted but resolute. The agents weren't just looking at her case. They dug into years of complaints against Coleman, Miller, and others. It got ugly. 15 excessive force complaints, 7 racial profiling claims, 3 internal affairs investigations, all buried, pushed under the rug by those meant to hold them accountable. Emails showed supervisors joking about shaking down troublemakers and old-fashioned street cleaning. Texts between Coleman and Miller bragged about rough arrests. Photos showed evidence tampering, chain of custody violations. Even with body cams, video had disappeared until someone wiser or angrier found backups, replaying every incriminating second. Agents studied monitors, taking notes with icy detachment, building a case that would ruin careers. One clip made Sarah's stomach churn. A black teen, under 16, face first on a patrol car hood, crying as Coleman insulted him. No crime, just wrath. Another showed Miller grinning as he shoved a Latina woman into a squad car for talking back during a traffic stop. She wasn't cited, just stopped for questioning. Each video chipped away at any defense the department thought they could muster. You couldn't sell this as reasonable. Robert stood in the center, arms crossed, jaw hard, not triumphant, but with slow-burning, lifelong rage. Special Agent Ramirez turned to Sarah, voice calm but authoritative. "Enough to recommend criminal charges," she said, ticking off misconduct. Obstruction of justice, fabricating police reports, evidence tampering, deprivation of rights under color of law. That's just the start. Robert nodded grimly, satisfied. Sarah said nothing, soaking it in. It was never about her. It was about the teen against the car, the woman shoved in the squad car, the countless others who didn't have a Robert Johnson waiting. Outside, news vans lined the street. Protesters waved signs. Media shouted questions. The city awake and irate. Agent Ramirez watched the conference table phone vibrate. She answered, listened, and covered the receiver, looking at Robert. "Internal Affairs placed the police chief on administrative leave," she said. Robert raised an eyebrow. Ramirez smiled faintly. "Not exactly. The Attorney General's office called him in, strongly suggested it." Robert laughed dryly. "Guess he finally saw which way the wind's blowing." Ramirez nodded, returning to the phone. Sarah sat back, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the tidal shift. She thought of the pharmacy manager's sneer, Coleman's grip, the way they treated her like garbage. Now the world knew. Another agent dropped a heavy file on the table. "Financials," he said to Ramirez. "We followed the money. Civil asset forfeiture misconduct. Off-the-books bonuses for top street stop cops." Sarah's stomach twisted tighter. Predators, bullies, rewarded by the algorithm. Ramirez flipped through the documents quickly. "This is systemic corruption," she said. Robert didn't smile or boast, just nodded. He knew why he fought so hard even after retirement, why he hadn't paused when Sarah called. This wasn't just a bad department, it was a sickness that needed cutting out. Agents kept filing evidence, preparing formal charges, planning to expand the inquiry to other precincts, other cities. It was just the beginning. Sarah stood, stiff from the night. Robert caught her eye, asking softly, "You ready for the next part?" Her gaze was steady. "I was born ready," she said, and meant it. The news broke faster than anyone could handle. That afternoon's press conference was packed, reporters filling every inch, microphones like weapons. The Savannah mayor stood pallid behind the podium, like a man at his own funeral. The interim police chief, a woman who hadn't slept in days, held a dossier of prepared remarks that felt worthless. Robert and Sarah sat quietly in front, flanked by FBI and DOJ officials like sentinels. The mayor cleared his throat, voice shaky. "Today we're announcing major changes in response to the DOJ's probe." He paused, eyeing the federal officials like he needed permission. "We acknowledge systemic faults in our police department have led to civil rights abuses, misuse of authority, and failure to protect our citizens." Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, pencils flying. Sarah sat still, every muscle tight, not trusting it yet. Words were cheap, promises cheaper. She needed action, and she wasn't alone. The mayor swallowed hard. "Effective immediately, Savannah Police Department officers, Rick Coleman and David Miller, are terminated." A clamor erupted, the crowd's wrath washing over him. He continued, "Criminal charges are being filed against both for misconduct, fabricating police reports, federal civil rights violations, and unlawful arrest." Camera flashes couldn't light the room enough for Sarah to feel it in her bones. The mayor flicked a note page, trembling slightly. "We're also launching an independent review of all complaints against the department over the last decade. A federal monitor will oversee all future operations." He breathed deeply, reaching the part he dreaded most. "And we publicly apologize to Ms. Sarah Johnson." All eyes turned to her, the mayor's voice heavy but rehearsed. "We know Ms. Johnson was wrongly accused, humiliated, and degraded. They abused their power. We're sorry." The words were thin, brittle. Sarah didn't move or blink, letting the silence stretch, not making it easy. Robert sat beside her, calm but watchful. The interim chief added, "We're committed to rebuilding trust," her voice firmer than the mayor's. "We'll mandate racial bias training, overhaul internal reviews, and create community oversight channels." More promises. Sarah absorbed each word. Promises were easy when cameras rolled, but the real test came when the lights went out. Questions flew. Reporters shouted over microphones. When did the department learn of Coleman and Miller's complaints? How deep is the corruption? Will higher-ups be held accountable? "Ms. Johnson, how do you feel?" Sarah rose slowly, the room quieting instantly, every eye on her. She didn't step to the podium, just stood. "I didn't survive last night to hear hollow apologies," she said, voice steady. "I'm here because people like me are ignored, discarded." Her voice grew stronger. "I'm just the one who had someone strong enough to hear my cry. Thousands don't, and their names never make the paper, never get justice." She scanned the room, gaze steadfast. "I accept your apology," she said, steel in her voice, "but I won't accept anything less than real lasting change." A roar erupted outside, shaking the windows. Sarah turned and left, leaving politicians scrambling. The crowd parted like a wave as she stepped into the sunlight. Reporters yelled, protesters chanted her name, others touched her shoulder as if her strength could rub off. Robert followed silently, proud at the edges. Sarah glanced at the throng, the cameras, the raw electric emotion in the air. Bigger than her now, bigger than she'd imagined in that cold cell. Hands bound, head pounding. It was a movement, just beginning. Robert touched her arm. "You changed something today." Sarah smiled, a tired mix of melancholy and hope. "Maybe," she murmured, "but not enough." Robert chuckled softly. "It's a start. Broken, imperfect, but for the first time in a while, the world seemed to tilt toward justice. Sarah Johnson, nurse, survivor, fighter, was at the center where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed flew by too fast. It started softly in a city used to ignoring its wounds. Community leaders meeting, civil rights lawyers in small rooms. Long talks, emails, and calls between people who didn't trust each other, but shared the same injuries, the same festering rage. Then it grew. Men, women, teens, elders came forward. Former victims with old and new stories, all cut from the same cloth of shame, violence, and silence. Sarah attended the first meeting by chance, invited by Robert's old colleague, human rights attorney Marcus Dean, to listen, not speak. They sat in the back of a rented church hall, metal chairs cold and unforgiving, and listened. A young black man, wrongfully jailed for jogging after matching a description. A Latina mother pulled from her car at gunpoint for a broken taillight. An elderly man battered during a late-night welfare check turned violent without cause. Stories poured out, uncontrolled. Sarah felt something settle in her chest, a heavy, aching rage, not just for her own pain, but for the system that allowed it. Robert sat beside her, stone-faced, jaw tight, absorbing every word, every injustice, his fingers tapping his biceps silently. Marcus stood at the front, and the room quieted. "We have a chance," he said clearly. "We have evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, will." He paused. "We can sue as a class action. Sue the city, the police, the officers involved." The room buzzed with low anxiety, some terrified, some suspicious, others nodding with fiery resolve. Marcus looked at Sarah in the back. "But we can't do it without a face, a public figure." Every head turned. Sarah felt the weight, sudden and unmistakable. She wanted to shrink, to let someone else carry it. But then she remembered the metal bench, the cuffs biting her wrists, Coleman's icy stare, the teens shaking hands against the car, his muffled tears, the woman thrown into the squad car, the ghostly faces filling the room. "I'll do it," she said, standing slowly, voice steady. The lawsuit moved faster than expected. Within a month, the legal team filed official documents, dozens of plaintiffs, hundreds of pages of abuse, a clear demand for accountability, restitution, and federal oversight. The city fought back with pricey lawyers and carefully worded denials of systemic issues, blaming individual cases and miscommunications. But the evidence was overwhelming, the public pressure relentless, national media attention impossible to bury. Cracks appeared in the city's defenses. The police chief resigned quietly at night, no press conference or farewell. Half a dozen senior officers were suspended for buried complaints. The mayor announced he wouldn't run again, citing health issues no one believed. Other cities reached out. Community organizers, civil rights groups, agency whistleblowers, asking Savannah for advice, for help, for how they did it. One arrest, one wrong, became a model. One evening, Sarah sat with Robert on the back porch of her small cottage, crickets chirping in the humid Georgia air, the sky deep purple and gold as the last sunlight faded. She sipped sweet tea, letting the calm settle. "You ever think we'd see something like this?" she asked. Robert laughed softly. "Not in my lifetime, not even in my dreams." They sat longer, watching each star emerge. "It's not over," Sarah said finally. Robert shook his head. "It never is, never will be. Always another fight, another war." He glanced at her, eyes fierce with pride. "But you're still here." Sarah grinned, a real one, exhausted but hopeful. Not blind or naive, but hard-earned, grown from fighting through the worst and emerging whole. Inside, her phone buzzed. Another reporter, another civil rights leader asking her to speak at a rally. Sarah let it buzz. Tonight she just wanted to sit under the stars with her father. She'd take up the battle tomorrow, because she knew the real power wasn't in one lawsuit, one exposed cop, or one broken system. The strength was in speaking up, being seen, no matter the cost. 6 months later, Savannah was a different city. The protests faded, but the changes lingered. New police leadership, new policies, new faces in halls where old ghosts once roamed. For the first time in a long time, community members began to believe change might stick. Sarah stood on the polished floors of a federal courtroom, watching the trial's final moments. The air was thick with anticipation. Rick Coleman and David Miller sat stiffly at the defense table, suits crumpled, faces pallid. Gone were the haughty smirks, the swagger. They looked smaller, diminished not by the trial, but by the reality catching up. The jury returned. Sarah stared without blinking as the foreman stood, verdict slips in trembling hands. Obstruction of justice, guilty. Fabricating police reports, guilty. Wrongful arrest and civil rights deprivation, guilty, guilty, guilty. The words echoed in the thick silence, bouncing off marble walls, falling like dust. Coleman slumped forward, head in hands. Miller stared ahead, eyes vacant. Neither looked at Sarah, they didn't dare. The judge thanked the jury and adjourned. Reporters whispered, gathering papers, but Sarah stood still, letting it wash over her. She didn't feel victorious, just exhausted, a good kind of tired, the kind after a brutal fight when you've left everything on the field. Robert touched her elbow, bringing her back. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded. They left the courthouse together, past reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, curiosity seekers craning their necks to see the woman who'd become a symbol of something greater. Outside, the air was chilly and sweet with the first hints of spring. Azaleas bloomed on sidewalks, defiant against the weather, set against old brick houses. Sarah inhaled deeply. Freedom smelled different today. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Marcus Dean waited, briefcase over one shoulder, a big smile. "You did it," he said. Sarah shook her head. "We did it." Robert clapped Marcus on the back, and the three savored the moment. The system had bent, fractured, even if it hadn't shattered. Robert's phone buzzed. Another call from a community leader, another request for guidance. He ignored it with a thumb sweep, pocketing it. Today wasn't for work. They skipped press conferences and interviews, driving to Sarah's favorite diner on the outskirts, peeling vinyl booths, the best peach cobbler for 100 miles. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Over greasy burgers and sweet tea, they talked about everything but the case. Robert's failing tomato plants, Marcus's daughter's college acceptance, Sarah's dream of a long overdue vacation, somewhere she didn't have to be strong 24/7, where she could just be. When Robert dropped her off at her house, Sarah lingered on the porch long after he drove away, watching kids ride bikes on the quiet street, an old couple walking their dog, the world happening again. For the first time in forever, she felt she could live, not just survive. Kicking off her shoes, she sank onto the living room couch with a deep sigh, checking her phone. More requests to speak, to lead. Sarah smiled faintly, setting the phone face down on the coffee table. Today she wasn't a symbol, wasn't the humiliated woman tossed into a pharmacy cage, dragged through the muck, and stood up anyway. She was just Sarah, the woman who refused to let them define her, who reminded a city, maybe a country, that nobody can give you dignity. You have to carry it inside, even when the world tries to take it away. She closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, the kids playing down the street, their laughter. She'd won, not because the system was perfect or the fight was over, but because she was still fighting and maybe inspiring others to do the same. The road ahead would be hard. More battles, more nights of feeling overwhelmed. But Sarah Johnson knew something they could never take away. She was more than their assumptions, their chains, their petty cruelties. She was free, not because they said so, but because she said so. That was the only justice that mattered. Sarah's story might seem like a personal victory, but it's a broader reminder that injustice can lurk anywhere, often under our noses, and it takes bravery, tenacity, and the resolve to stand tall when everything's stacked against you to change it. Every moment someone's made to feel they don't belong, every voice silenced, every wrong buried under the rug. Sarah's fight shows that standing up matters, no matter how hard, no matter how long it takes. It's a lesson we can all carry, whether helping a neighbor, advocating for community rights, or teaching the young that dignity and respect are non-negotiable. If this story touched you, I hope it inspires you to share it with someone who needs to hear it, to stand up and not look away. Together, when we stand without turning back, we're stronger than ever alone. Resilience and belief in justice shine through Sarah Johnson's story, a powerful lesson for seniors. At 58, Sarah's courage to confront injustice sparks systemic change, proving that life experience fuels impactful action. This teaches us that age is no barrier to defending dignity or inspiring others. Every voice, no matter how small, can ignite transformation when rooted in persistence. For older adults, your wisdom and resolve can guide communities toward fairness. Share your story, support the unheard, or advocate for what's right. Your actions matter. Stand up, speak out, and inspire change no matter your age.